Hello and welcome to Books to Last, the podcast that challenges readers to pick the only 5 books they may take with them when cast away to a mystery remote location. As ever, I'm joined by a book-loving guest, and this week is no exception. I'm joined by a very special guest. I'm joined by Flora Carr, the author of Tower. Welcome, Flora. It's so great to have you on the podcast. I'm so excited.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for your time. And yeah, very, very honoured to have you on. For the benefit of any listeners who may not be familiar with you, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and books and reading and all that good stuff?
Yeah, of course. Where to begin? I should probably say I'm a debut author. My book, which is literary feminist historical fiction, it's called The Tower. It's out in the UK on the 7th of March and then in the US on the 5th of March. And it's set in 1567 and it follows a young, pregnant Mary Queen of Scots after she is defeated by the rebel Scottish lords and is imprisoned in an island fortress in the middle of a vast loch, Lochleven. And she's joined there by 2 chambermaids, Jane and Cuckoo, and her lady-in-waiting and childhood friend, Lady Seaton. And in the hothouse environment of the castle rooms, tempers and nerves fray, alliances shift, and the 4 women have to come together in order for there to have any hope of escape. And it's about love and lust. There's a sapphic love story in the book, but I think it's mostly about female friendship, really, and sort of reimagining this kind of slice of Mary Stuart's life through the lens of female friendship. So I'm really excited about that. And yeah, it's my debut book. I've always been very interested in literature and history, and the book sort of melds those 2 loves together. And I think with the picks that I have for today's podcast, you'll kind of see almost like exactly where I sort of started to fall in love with historical fiction. I've gone quite nostalgic today. I hope that's all right.
Absolutely fine. We love a bit of nostalgia on the podcast. There's always at least one pick that almost every guest is like, this is purely for nostalgia. This is a book that I read when I was 12 and impressionable.
Yeah, exactly that.
Yeah, I mean, as a big lover of history and fiction and all related subjects as well, I was really excited to get a chance to read The Tower after Cheltenham Literature Festival. And yeah, it's a really great, it's such a great, it sounds really trite to think, but yeah, it's such a great read and it's amazing. And one of the things that I really, really enjoyed about it is you talk about obviously the female friendship, but I really liked how it sort of explored how female friendship sort of comes up against like female rivalry and how a lot of that is usually inflicted from external forces. And it's just a really, vivid sort of just really interesting read. And as someone who I wouldn't call myself an expert on Mary Queen of Scots by any stretch of the imagination, but I've sort of familiar with her story. This was a part of her life I wasn't really as aware of.
Me neither.
So it made it sort of, if you find with a lot of historical fiction, I'm always a bit like, oh, well, you know the ending because it's history. But even during it, I was reading along and I was like, oh, I need to know what happens next, as if it's not a foregone conclusion what happens in the end. And I found myself getting really caught up as if it could have any, like, obviously it doesn't, it only stretches sort of a year's time period. But I just, found myself getting really caught up and thinking, oh, I just need to know what happens, even though, strictly speaking, I do know what happens to Mary Queen of Scots.
Oh, that makes me so happy that you enjoyed it. And yeah, I also hadn't heard about this period of her life. I knew, obviously everyone knows about her long captivity in England. But I wrote this book precisely because I hadn't heard of it. And it was this really pivotal, action-packed moment a moment in time during her life. And yeah, I think you're totally right about the female friendship aspect of it. It is looking at female friendship, but with all the complexities and power imbalances that entails. And I really enjoyed writing that aspect of it. So I'm so glad that you enjoyed that bit.
Yeah, it's a really great thing. I mean, I know what you mean. There's a big preoccupation with the time that she spent in England, which is sort of comparatively not probably the most consequential time period of her life. I visited Hardwick Hall recently with my sort of National Trust membership. Well, they've got the sort of Mary Queen of Scots bedroom and all that sort of thing, despite the fact that she never would have stayed there, and it didn't look like that when she wasn't when she was being kept there. And I was like, this is just bizarre. But yeah, a really great book, and obviously inspired by sort of the other things. What do you kind of like to read in your spare time? What's the last great book that you read?
The last great book. Well, that's such a good question. I have to say, at the moment, I'm only sort of a third of the way through, so it's a little early to say whether it's the next great book that I've read. But I'm really enjoying The Fraud by Zadie Smith. It's again, historical fiction. And it's a reimagining of this real life trial in the Victorian period in sort of Dickensian London called the Tichborne trial. And I say Dickensian London because Charles Dickens is actually with it in the book, and it's from the perspective of a character called Eliza Touchet, who is the Scottish sister-in-law of another famous Victorian era author who sort of runs in the same circles, and it's from her perspective. I'm really enjoying it so far. Yeah.
Sounds really interesting. So like a court procedural, but also in Victorian.
Yeah. I'm not actually at the court era. At the moment, I'm still in the kind of the setup period, but I'm eagerly anticipating the courtroom drama.
Great. And I mean, so do you tend to stick with historical fiction, or do you read a lot of other genres? I mean, I'm a bit of a mood reader myself, so.
I read really widely. I read a lot of fiction and non-fiction. Actually, one of the picks for today is non-fiction, which I hope is allowed.
It is.
I'm reading another book at the moment called Above Us the Sea, which actually isn't out until I think, is it June or July of this year, and it's by Anya Card, who's a friend of mine, and it's very much sort of set in the modern day, and it's about a young Polish woman who is a student and moves to Cardiff, and she befriends two young gay men, and they enter into this very ambiguous love triangle, and then tragedy strikes, and it's so good so far. Again, I haven't finished it yet, but I'm really enjoying it, and I am friends with Anya, but I'm not biased. It's great.
I think sometimes there are a lot of books, as even quite early on, you get like an instinct for when a book is really going to sort of be really good, and you never want to call it too soon, just in case. But I think usually you can sort of feel it quite early on. So yeah, those are really interesting reads. So we're going to get to hear a lot more about the kind of things you like to read as we get into the main bit of the podcast. As mentioned, you're going to pick 5 books you can take with you, and you're going to be cast away. Where would you like to be cast away to? Because as always, we do not relegate all of our guests to desert islands if they don't want to be.
Yeah, this was the only easy decision for entering into this podcast. I found all the books I found choosing really difficult, but when it came to the location, I knew exactly where I wanted to be. I want to be in a little hut overlooking the sea on like a kind of grey. I don't mind if it's rainy, little island, very sort of English coastal vibes, the sound of the sea outside, big glass windows, and I'll be happy.
Sounds nice. I mean, rain's always really great ambiance for reading, sort of being curled up and
And
sort of,
writing. Yeah.
yes. It's I tend to engage with the rain white noise when it's not actually raining. And I was a very strange child that used to get very excited if we had a power cut at home. Like if there was a bad storm and then we ended up with a power cut, I got to like regress into a non-technological era where I would just use candles or just use like daylight, heaven forbid, to do non-technical things. It was quite exciting. So yeah, a rainy hut overlooking the sea. That sounds really lovely. So what is the first book you'll be taking with you to your hut?
Okay. So the first book, it is called, I'm going to treat this like a game show. I've got copies of the book. I'm going to wave it in front of the screen, which none of your listeners can see, but it's more for my benefit.
It's for my benefit. I can
for
see
your
it.
For your benefit as well. It's Playing Beatty Bow by Ruth Park. So when I was a kid, I was a huge fan of time slip novels, I should say. So it's young adult fiction, and it's sort of similar genre to Tom's Midnight Garden or A Traveller in Time by Alison Utley. And actually the latter I almost picked because that was probably my first real introduction to Mary Queen of Scots, because it was sort of set in, it's again another time slip book, and it sort of covers the Babington plot. But Playing Beatty Bow is a Australian children's book, and I remember when I got it, I think I was maybe around 9, and Australian family friends brought it to the UK for me, and it just blew my mind. I think it was published in 1980, and it follows Abigail Kirk. She's a 14-year-old girl, and she travels back in time to Victorian era Sydney, Australia. And she's quite unsympathetic heroine, kind of Mary Lennox vibes. She's very brittle, but at the same time, she's very vulnerable. So at the start of the book, her parents have gone through a really painful divorce and a few years prior. And then at the start of the book, her mum and her dad announced that they want to get back together, which she really sort of goes up against. And she witnesses a sort of children's playground game called Beatty Bow. It's like a kind of chase game. And she sees a young girl watching the game, absolutely transfixed. And this little girl, she's dressed in rags. And I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to say that she turns out to be Beatty Bow herself, and she's come back in time. She's watching modern day children play this game and sort of calling her name. And no one knows why they're playing this game. The origins have kind of been lost to memory. Anyway, through sort of a sequence of events, Abigail then follows Beatty back in time and gets stuck there. And it's so gorgeous. I think there's also a really poignant love story in there. It has like a final twist at the end. It's very bittersweet. It doesn't shy away from the kind of harsh realities of that period, particularly for women. And I think, along with the other books I've just mentioned, it was really an amazing introduction to historical fiction for me. And I think just time slip young adult novels in general are such a great way of getting a young reader into historical fiction, because there's that element of fantasy and magic, which you come for the magic and you stay for how well the author evokes the past, the sort of time, the time period.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not one that I've ever heard of, but it sounds really interesting, and I completely agree. Like, having historical fiction for young adults is great because it kind of, I mean, history, especially the way it's taught in a lot of UK schools, well, not all UK schools, but the majority of UK schools, it's not the most exciting subject to all children. I mean, I found it very exciting, but I am an outlier. I acknowledge that I do not represent the general population. So having like something like a time travel or time slip novel is a great way to kind of engage young people in it. And I suppose see that through line between history and current day, as opposed to it feeling like something very remote and unconnected to their lives, which I think would be quite easy to think of when you're learning about Henry VIII's 6 wives in the classroom.
I think the fact that I'm always recommending this book and no one's ever heard of it. I never see it in UK bookstores. So that was why I was so excited to talk about it on this podcast. Yeah, I hope more people read it. It deserves to be read really widely, I think. In Australia, it's a children's classic.
I'd never even consider, because I mean, obviously, there's a lot of children's classics. Obviously, we've got sort of, Peter Pan's and that sort of thing over here. I suppose, yeah, it makes sense that obviously all countries would have their own specific sort of children's literature classics, in the same way that they probably don't all celebrate the same general like adult classics. So yeah, I'd be interested to see what other gems there are sort of less well known in other countries in terms of classic ones. But yeah, and also exploring the dark undertones there is to a lot of childhood things, like how most nursery rhymes and fairy tales have got really like dark origin.
Yes, I hadn't even thought about that, but yes, precisely.
Well, I mean, a really great and, like you say, nostalgic one. It's always great. I think having one of those books that really sort of intrigues you and brings you into reading at a young age they're always really special. And I find that like the books that I really loved when I was younger, it's really hard for me to be sort of talked out of liking them even as I get older in my taste. Well, it's a great start, and I can't wait to hear what else we get to hear, other books we get to talk about. What is the second book that you'll be taking?
Yes. So number 2 is On Chapel Sands by Laura Cumming. In the US, it's called 5 Days Gone. And it's my nonfiction pick. And I went through a real sort of nonfiction phase where I was reading sort of H is for Hawk and The Shepherd's Tale, some real modern classics of the genre. And I read this and it just blew me away. So Laura Cumming is a very well-known art critic, and she's written some best-selling books on sort of famous 17th century artists. But this is a memoir. And I say memoir, but it's part memoir, it's part detective, it's part art criticism. So essentially it's focused on the various mysteries surrounding her own mother, starting with this period of a few days when, as a child, she went missing on a local beach, the author's mother, I mean, when she was 3 years old in the late 1920s, 1929. And becomes like a detective, where she looks at old family photos, basically with the same kind of critical gaze that she lends to art when she's criticizing art, and she's trying to solve these sort of long-standing family mysteries. And it's such a beautiful book, and it's the book that whenever anyone says, do you have any book recommendations, I always say this one. I just love it. I can't recommend it enough. It's so good. And it's full of reproductions of sort of old family photos and like famous artworks. It's just amazing.
That sounds so interesting. That sounds also like a book that I would never have sort of found by accident by myself, I don't think. But it sounds really fascinating. It's always good to have like go-to recommendation if someone asks you for a recommendation. I feel like authors get that quite a lot all the time. It's like, oh, well, you write books, you must immediately have several to mind that you can recommend.
Do you have one, like a go-to book you always recommend?
I don't, because I'm always really like, I kind of have this like mission for me, because I'm kind of the opinion that everybody, even people who don't think they like to read, does like to read. They just need to find the right book. So I almost feel like I have to like almost matchmake people with a book that I think that they'll really, really enjoy based on their specific sort of preference. I mean, I've got like a lot of classics that I'm really fond of, which I'm like, I feel like everyone should read them, but I also know not everybody will enjoy them because it's down to specific preference. But God, do I have one that I would recommend? I can't think of one off the top. I don't know. Yeah, no, I feel like I make it way too specific. I probably overthink it way too much when people ask me for a book recommendation. It's like I need to know your specific likes and dislikes before I'm willing to recommend you a book.
See, maybe I'm accidentally imposing my own likes and dislikes onto other people. I feel like your way of recommending a book is a lot more tailored and nuanced than mine.
See, if I know someone likes reading generally, I would be more inclined to recommend books that I just really enjoy. But I feel like my mission in life is to get people who think that they don't like to read to try reading a book. That's very much me imposing my own, because you know what? Doing other things with your spare time is a perfectly valid thing to do as well.
Yeah.
But so on top of that sounds like it sounds like a really visual book. Is it formatted in a way where you have like, do you need the physical copy? It's not an audio book to read.
I would say you in this case, I'm a big fan of audiobooks, but I think in this case you really benefit from having the physical copy, particularly since there are some old photographs that I don't want to veer into spoilers, but there are some old photographs where they're introduced at the beginning and you don't really think much of them, and then kind of halfway through the book you're sort of desperately flipping back, sort of seeing the clues that were there all along, sort of hidden in the photograph.
See, now this actually sounds like a book I'd really like to get my husband, because he really loves like mysteries and detective and stuff. And I tell him there's a mystery to solve and he gets actual evidence. I think I could really, he's someone who's not a big reader, but I could really get him into trying to solve it as he goes along. That sounds like so fascinating. I also think it's great when professionals in a specific field, I suppose in this case, an art critic, but in other instances where they apply their, I suppose, professional expertise to their own personal life in a really interesting way, because I think it lends like a really refined sort of, because I think a lot of people, obviously I think a lot of memoirs are really interesting, but I mean, for instance, I think Hitler, Stalin, Mum and Dad was recently written by I'm going to have to double check. I'm pretty sure it's Danny Finkelstein, who's a journalist. And that is very much like doing a similar thing where applying like journalistic investigations to his own family history and applying that backwards. So the idea of someone who's taken it is Danny Finkelstein. I'm glad that I remembered that correct. Sorry, I'm so bad with names. It sounds similar with like, I never would have thought of like an art critic sort of using that expertise as a way to figure out some of their own mysteries. I mean, I always thought it would be really cool to have some kind of like long-standing family secret or mystery that could be solved, because I always thought that would be really fascinating. I feel like in reality it's probably not. It's actually probably not a very good thing, and it's nice to have a boring background.
Yeah, in this book it's sort of like a secret within a secret within a secret. There are just sort of layers and layers that you're peeling back, and she writes so beautifully, and it's just this really, it's a love letter really to her mum and to both her parents, who are both artists. And yeah, it's so poignant. I'd really recommend it.
Amazing. Okay, so that is your nonfiction pick.
Mm-hmm.
And also a genre of nonfiction I don't usually go towards, so I'd actually be really interested to check that one out myself. What is the third book you'll be taking with you?
So the third book is Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. It was published in 2020. I actually saw the West End adaptation, the stage adaptation, late last year, and I really enjoyed it. And I hadn't read the book in a while, so after I watched the play, I went home and I reread the book, and I'd almost forgotten just how good it is. And for those who haven't sort of heard of it or who aren't quite sure what it's about, it's a kind of reimagining of William Shakespeare's marriage to his wife Anna, who in this book is called Agnes, and it's about their relationship with their children, in particular their youngest son Hamnet, who, it's not a spoiler to say that he dies at a young age from the plague. And the book is Maggie O'Farrell's sort of interpretation of that time, and sort of, it's speculative historical fiction, and it's about the writing of Hamlet and how Hamlet's death possibly inspired the play Hamlet. But it's mostly told from the perspective of Agnes, who is sort of, I've listened to Maggie O'Farrell talking about the book in sort of various podcasts, and Agnes has been very much maligned by historians, and this is kind of a reclaiming of her story and what it must have been like to be married to quite a potentially volatile genius, who was absent for quite a lot of their marriage, and also what it must have been like to lose a child. And it's really beautiful. It's really, obviously it's very sad, and I cried the first time I read it. I cried the second time I read it. I'll probably cry again. But the ending I find really heartwarming and sort of life affirming. And I found the play really powerful, but I find the book even more so, particularly the ending.
Hamlet's a book that's been on my shelf basically since it came out, and I've yet to read it because I'm one of those people. But yeah, I've heard absolutely nothing but amazing things about it. And yeah, I find the exploration of the lives of women who are in close proximity to powerful and or talented men in history who everyone's heard a lot about always is really fascinating, because there are so many examples where they come so much worse off. And I mean, William Shakespeare is one of those people from history where it's like, it feels like absolutely everybody he touches comes off worse off than he does. It's just like, if you were a playwright at the same time, you inevitably get somehow shafted by his mere presence. But yeah, it's always really interesting, especially with writers and like incredibly talented writers, regardless of your own personal taste on their work. Usually have sort of families and women and people in their lives who get often forgotten about in the sort of fuzzy glow of, brilliance that follows them around.
Yeah, there's I almost chose. Actually, we can talk about it at the end.
Oh, we can
edit that bit out.
There you go. You've got a nice sneak peek for the honourable mentions. So, Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. Have you read any of her other books out of curiosity? Because I know she's got a few out there, and I wondered if maybe is this a particular favourite?
No, this is the only work that I've read of hers, which is shocking to say. I know
I've read none, so you're one ahead of me.
But I absolutely love it, and ever since I read it, I've been meaning to read some of her. Actually, no, wait. I have read another one of her books. I read The Marriage Portrait, which came out after Hamnet, and which is also historical fiction. But I haven't read her non-historical fiction books.
Yeah, I really love
the two.
Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say the two that I've read, Hamnet and The Marriage Portrait, I've really enjoyed.
Yeah, I really love this genre of sort of historical fiction and speculative fiction that's really exploring these like really niche and unknown times, or sort of lesser understood sort of parts of history, especially adjacent to quite similar to The Tower, but also with, The Marriage Portrait and Hamnet for Maggie O'Farrell, just these sort of like little pockets of mystery in stories that everyone thinks they know really, really well. I think it's a great thing that's happening. So I'm always excited to see more of them coming out. Okay, so we're over halfway and we're on to the fourth book you'll be taking with you.
Okay, so this book probably would have been on the list anyway, but I was very aware that if I'm stranded on a deserted island, I need some chunkier choices, and then these next two books are both fulfill that brief. So this book, my fourth pick, is Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, and I know a lot of your listeners will probably have heard of it and don't need like a potted summary, but I can give one anyway. It's about Thomas Cromwell, who was a statesman during the reign of Henry VIII, and he effectively orchestrated England's break from the Roman Catholic Church, and he was also eventually, spoiler alert, the architect of Anne Boleyn's fall from power. And it's one of those books where it won the Booker Prize, so you know it's going to be great. It's a work of genius. But I think what's often forgotten about in conversations about Wolf Hall and it's of the two other books that followed it is that it's really funny. Thomas Cromwell is a funny character. He has a really dry sense of humour, which is partly sort of Mantel's voice shining through in the narration. But it's a fun read. It's pacey. It's a chunky book, but it's a page turner.
Yeah.
And just the quality of the writing is amazing. I think mostly after you've read a book, I think it's quite rare that you remember specific sentences. I think the point of reading is when you recall a book, you recall the feeling you had when you read the book. But with Hilary Mantel, I can remember some specific images she evoked in the pages. I remember her comparing the ghost of Cardinal Wolsey to, I think it was a dove falling down, a soft dove falling down a chimney. Just her language is so beautiful. So as a writer, sort of locked in my little hut in the middle of nowhere, I'll be leafing through it, sort of trying to discern all the genius of the work. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, having that, especially because you say it's quite a large book, I mean, being able to sustain that over so many pages, because I often find, like, with quite chunky books, there are some books where you sort of read it and even though it was really good, you go, could probably have lost about 20% of the page.
Not with this.
And then there's other ones where you're like, oh, I understand why it was that long. It absolutely had to be that long to have everything in it. And yeah, it's always quite impressive when it can be sustained over that time. And that's actually something I've not heard. So I've heard a lot about Hilary Mantel when she passed away recently. Obviously, there was a lot of tributes and stuff made. And yeah, I it's one of those authors' names where, like, you see them in so many bookshops that, like, you're just generally aware of them in the zeitgeist.
Yeah.
But I had never really considered that a historical fiction set during Tudor times and about things like as bureaucratic as disabling Church of England, you know, all of that would be funny. So I mean, she's one of those authors I feel like I would have always wanted to get round to reading. Yeah, would you say this is a good? Sorry, go on.
She's a really funny writer. I love her. I love reading her essays and reviews of books. She's got like a collection with, I think it's the London Literary Review, and I'd really recommend those. She's so, she's a very funny writer personally.
I actually think I have heard a mention of the reviews. Would you say if someone was wanting to try Hilary Mantel's writing, would you recommend starting with Wolf Hall or a different book, or maybe some of her nonfiction? What do you think would be a good starting point?
I think I have read Wolf Hall both in the physical format, but also in the audio format. And I'm not sure about Bring Up the Bodies or The Mirror and the Light, which are the two sequels. But Wolf Hall, the audiobook narrator, is Dan Stevens, and he perfectly encapsulates that kind of like wry, slightly dry, witty, very clever voice the book has. And that was my introduction to Wolf Hall audiobook, and then subsequently sort of reading the physical copy. So I'd say that was a good way in. Yeah.
I can imagine Dan Stevens doing a really excellent job of that, because that's basically his character's voice in Downton Abbey. Okay, well, we have reached the fifth and final book of your list. What is the last book you'll be taking with you to your rainy writer's cabin?
So the last book, like the first, is another sort of nostalgia pick for when I'm alone in my hut, and also a good chunky size for whiling away the days. It is The Amber Spyglass by Philip Pullman. It's the final installment of the His Dark Materials trilogy, and I'm sure your listeners probably don't need an introduction to it, but it's this final installment. It's about Lyra and Will, who are two children from different worlds. Quite literally, they live in parallel universes. And in Lyra's, they have demons. I'm never quite sure how to pronounce it.
And every screen adaptation changes. So they're not consistent.
I think it's meant to be demons, but because I read Damons in my head, for the listeners, the spelling is Daemon. So, and anyway, the demons are the animal representations of one's soul. And this book is the culmination of the trilogy. And it is just so beautiful and heartbreaking. And it has stayed with me all my adult life. I think I must have been about 12 when I read it, and it has stayed with me ever since. It's a beautiful book for children and for adults.
Yeah, I've heard. So I have very strong memories of watching The Golden Compass when I was younger, because that was my introduction to the series. And then I was very reliably told that, like most children's adaptations of TV shows into TV shows and films, the book is so much better.
Oh my God, no. No shade to The Golden Compass, but it's not quite the...
Based on the quality of on-screen adaptations of beloved children novels around about the same time, it does feel like it was kind of never going to be what it could be.
Have you watched the TV series, the BBC version?
So not yet, because basically by the time it came out, I'd resolved that I was going to read the trilogy and then watch the TV series, because I really wanted to, because I had a lot of close friends of mine who really love the series as well, and they were like, "Oh, you just need to give it a go." And
they were right.
And I find the concept really, really interesting as a novel. And I'm interested that you went with The Amber Spyglass because it's the last one. Is that just because it's just such an amazing conclusion?
It's an amazing... now that I know that you haven't read it, I'm going to be doubly careful with no spoilers. It is an amazing ending. It is famously bittersweet. I think a book that makes you cry is always really special, but one that made you cry when you were
a child,
a child, I think it's even more special and powerful and memorable. But yeah, I went with The Amber Spyglass partly because it's a culmination of all of these sort of different story threads, and partly also because the first installment, The Northern Lights, that doesn't include Will's world, which is our world. It's an introduction to Lyra's world, and it sort of sets up the rest of the trilogy. So that's why I chose The Amber Spyglass, so that it had all of the
You get the best of both worlds, literally.
Exactly.
Okay, well, I mean, it's really great. And I mean, as well as it's sort of being sort of having the historical elements, you've got sort of fantasy and like little threads of magic and stuff through that. So it's a really great list. You said it was really difficult to come to, and we're going to come on to your honourable mentions in a moment. Would you mind just recapping which 5 books you picked for the benefit of any listeners who might want to make a note?
Of course. So number 1 was Playing Beatty Bow by Ruth Park. Number 2 was On Chapel Sands by Laura Cumming. Number 3 was Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. Number 4 was Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. And number 5 was The Amber Spyglass by Philip Pullman.
Brilliant. And I mean, they will be listed as well in the podcast description for anybody, as well as other books that we've discussed during the episode. What were some books that you nearly picked but didn't quite make it onto the list?
Okay, so I already mentioned this first one, A Traveller in Time by Alison Utley, which is another kind of nostalgic time slip young adult book. It's a bit older than Playing Beatty Bow, and it's about, again, a young girl who accidentally travels back in time, this time to 16th century England, and she befriends the Babington family, who are sort of embroiled in the very beginnings of the Babington plot, which was a plot to try and free Mary Queen of Scots. And obviously the Tower is about Mary Queen of Scots, and this, although the Mary Stuart in this book is very different from the Mary Stuart in my book, it was an introduction at an early age to her and sort of to her captivity and her plight during sort of her life, which was great. Another almost pick was Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders, which was almost in the Hamlet slot. And I realised that they share a lot of very similar themes, even though in form they are so completely different. So Lincoln in the Bardo is a very experimental book. It won the Booker Prize, I think, in 2017. And it's about the period of time just after Willie Lincoln, who was the young son of President Abraham Lincoln, the period just after he died. Willie, I mean, not Abraham. And it's sort of set in the Bardo, which is this kind of transitional state between life and rebirth or the afterlife. Mm. And the book is told from the sort of first person of various ghosts that Willie meets, and they're all disfigured by the sort of things that happen to them in their life and their death. And it's quite a creepy story, which is maybe why I chose Hamlet in the end.
You didn't want to in your rainy hut.
Yeah, maybe. But it's such a great book, and you have to kind of you have to get into the specific rhythm whilst you're reading it. And once you're in that rhythm, it's amazing. And again, as we were talking about, it's about a famous man who loses his son, and it's a story about grief and love and life. And yeah, it's a great book. It really stayed with me.
I think I have heard of it because I think somebody, and I cannot remember which guest, one of the guests on A Good Read, the podcast, the BBC podcast, they picked it for their read, and they also sort of works for, yeah, I remember I could completely forgotten about it until you started mentioning about the sort of ghosts and the sort of transitional state. So I was like, because it's very, like you say, very experimental, very different to what
very experimental
to other books. Well, I mean, those are some great honorable mentions that people could also check out if they liked the rest of the books on your list. Honestly, I can't thank you enough. Thank you so much for coming on and talking to me all about books and the things you like to read. It's been a really, really fun, interesting discussion.
It has. Thank you so much for having me on. It's been so fun, and it's been such a joy to be able to spotlight my favorite books, particularly the first two, which I think maybe listeners might not have heard of in quite the same way as the last three.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's always great to have a mix of slightly more niche, lesser known options, because it's great to, there's so many books out there. It's really hard to basically to find all the great ones. So thank you so much for sharing your list. And thank you so much for coming out and talking about your own book, because as I say, I have read it. I really, really enjoyed it. I'm not saying that just because you're here. I have said it to other people when you've not been there. But if listeners wanted to check out you online and also where they could find your book, if they wanted to check out a great feminist historical fiction book about Mary Queen of Scots, where could they do all those things?
Yes. So I'm on Twitter at Flora Carr _ and then on Instagram at Flora Carr 13. And you can pre-order, or depending on when this podcast comes out, order your copy online at all the sort of usual places Waterstones, bookshop, org, whatever your choice is.
Yes. And if you're in time, you could get the Goldsboro edition like me.
Yes, the signed copies available at Goldsboro Books.
Amazing. So I highly recommend listeners go and check out Flora on Twitter and Instagram, and definitely go and buy The Tower. It's a really great, really sort of intriguing, atmospheric read. I properly felt like I was in Scotland at times. It was, a really great experience. And if people wanted to check out the podcast, where all good podcasts are found, feel free to subscribe if you enjoyed this episode and haven't already. And we are at Books to Last Pod on Instagram and basically nowhere else, because social media is really hard to keep. So yes, Flora, thank you so much for coming on. Listeners, thank you so much. You're so welcome. Yeah, and listeners, thank you so much for listening. And until next time, bye for now.